scary movies. God.
You don't?
No,
Really?
you don't know this. I don't do scary movies.
Oh, we're going to.
No.
Yeah.
You do
Beautiful shadow work.
You do not need to have this conversation.
Okay,
with Mike.
I know we started, but hold the phone because shadow work.
You know, there's a reason we call this the Disney therapist.
Yeah.
The scariest it gets is like in game. Like,
there are some really good shadow elements that I think we can pull out of things like Snow White. Like there's a lot of...
oh yeah, I'm fine with all that. We can do all that stuff. I'm not watching a scary movie. Welcome to the Disney therapist. We had just talked for like 3 minutes as we're recording about some horror movies, and we're not going to talk about that on the
we
show.
had to get it out of our system first.
I have no horror movies in my system. That's why I like Disney.
It's all in your shadow.
I don't like... yeah, whatever. We're not even going there. So in this episode, we are going to dive into the first MCU movie, Iron Man. And we realized it's really hard to talk about just Iron Man, the first movie, because there's so much Iron Man in other movies. So we look at all the characters. So we really are trying to focus just on this first Iron Man. I think if it's something we like talking about, we'll end up doing character studies probably of a lot of the MCU characters, or even other series where we see character development over multiple series. We can dive into the psyche of the character and kind of see what we can extract from it.
Yeah, and to add, it's also hard because comic books, right? I think we're trying to just stick with what we're getting from the cinematic universe. Yeah. Because if we were have to incorporate comic characters, we would have to delve into different timelines, right?
I would lose my nerd card. That's my first thought when I went to Comic-Con the first time. Mm-hmm. I was super excited. I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to be with my people. And then I was there and I was like, oh, I'm not, I don't know enough.
It's, right, look back to episode 2, identity, worthiness.
Yeah.
But, we're going to try to stick with just in the cinematic universe because it allows us to kind of look at one continuity, and who knows, maybe if it's something we really get into down the road, we could try, but we're going to stick with the movies for now.
A lot of research.
Yes.
For that. So spoiler for Iron Man, if you've not seen it,
I'm sorry.
You should go see it. What are you waiting for? So it came out over a decade ago. And so thoughts, we'll jump straight in. What are some of the thoughts about Iron Man?
Mm-hmm. So to kind of tease out some of the themes that I saw, not even saw, the things that I thought before I delved into it is...
prior thoughts.
Healthy regret. I think it's really cool how we can see someone so cocky about one way of life, and we can see how that identity and that way of thinking changes throughout the movie. And then one other important thing before I kind of pass it off and ask you is that just because we develop a harsh exterior, the Iron Man suit, does not mean that we're mending those internal wounds, right? So we're going to dive really into that, but...
I'm already thinking oh, I never even thought of that.
But and unfortunately, we won't see the conclusion of that in this movie, but we can see it definitely by Iron Man 3.
Yeah. So some of my thoughts prior is I saw a video essay about the MCU being all about fatherhood issues and father issues.
Okay.
So I kind of knew that going, that was one of my thoughts, is the first one is definitely about father issues. I also, when I was in graduate school, we did a presentation and I wrote a paper about, we talked about mental health in media. And I actually did a character study on Tony Stark.
Okay.
So we break down narcissistic personality disorder, we break down substance abuse, and then PTSD. Right. Okay. So those were the 3 big diagnoses that they give some examples with, and I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more about that. So that's one of the thoughts that I had beforehand. And then the other thing was it's really hard once you learn so much about a character to go back and just focus on one small piece.
Yeah.
So then my thought already was wow, that takes us so much. That's why therapy's so hard, right? Is that we're so complex. We know our history, right? Yeah. So we're so caught up in what's going on now. And I think a lot of times clients get frustrated with us, especially when we go slow and we're asking about the past and other things that happened. And they're why does this matter? But it matters because it's the first movie.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to kind of go there. So those were some of my thoughts beforehand.
And I love that last piece that you mentioned, because sometimes we miss things the first time we watch it, and so teasing at some of what kind of happens in the future Iron Man movies, is we can get really sucked into how he's responding in one movie and not seeing how that may have started here in the first movie. Just like how clients might be frustrated that we keep going back to an event 10 years ago, and they say things like, well, why does that matter now? That's not where I'm at.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's important for us to be able to find any point where we can pull the thread.
You're like, this is why it matters, because this is where it starts.
Yeah, and that's where we can track where the journey starts, and it allows us to kind of find where they're at in the story.
That's always I start a session, I'm talking with someone, and I'm like, so what was it like growing up? And they're like, I had a fine childhood. We don't have to talk about that. I'm like, duly noted. We end up talking about it, right? Absolutely. Like we find a way back to it, because it's like, okay, obviously there's something there, and it's neither good nor it's bad. It just is. So how do we understand it? Yeah,
and so definitely while I was watching this film and taking my notes, I had to kind of indicate where I was thinking about him in different movies, and so I had to indicate that so I don't roll into the next movie accidentally.
Okay. So it's the first thing, the movie. The movie starts off, I knew that, I've seen this movie, I don't even know how many times. I remember it starting off with kind of the attack, right? Mm-hmm. But I didn't realize, how traumatic and how quickly it starts. Because they do where he gets captured and the attack on the Humvees, mm-hmm. and then they go back a little bit. And I was kind of... not shocked, but it was like, oh, this is really traumatic. This is where he's at. The other thing that stood out to me at the very, very beginning is how, not socially unaware, socially unaware is what I wrote down, that he, okay, he's drinking, he's having a good time, he's just out selling his stuff, in the middle of a war zone. And there's no concept of where he's actually at. He just is kind of above the fray so much. Yeah. He's very aloof.
Yeah, same experience. I knew the attack was a big part of the movie, but I didn't realize it started with it. And mm-hmm. And just to kind of validate our last conversation, how our prior knowledge might not be accurate. And so how I thought it started with the pre-introduction, and then moved into the attack. No, it's actually backwards. And so this is why we go back and we look at things. I think he has this superiority complex when we begin. Right, he is above everything, and so he's very lackadaisical with everything. And I think it's really poignant that that's when they get attacked. Mm-hmm. It's very tense, and he does the best job at trying to bring everybody's tension down, saying, it's not a big deal. And as soon as that, right, he literally says, we're letting loose. And as soon as they let loose, boom. Yep. And that's just like how our unconscious affects us. The second when we relax and we feel like we're maybe alone or we have some peace, we're going to be affected by the things that kind of haunt us.
Something's going to come up.
Yes.
I know you said that you went really deep with this movie, and now I'm starting to see. I was like, I would never even thought of that. So it stood out for me, and I think I probably definitely stayed more surfacey with just kind of his behavior.
Yeah.
Is he fits a lot of characteristics of a narcissist, right? Mm-hmm. Whether or not he's a diagnosable narcissist, I don't think he fits the criteria. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because he's a narcissist in the way that it's about him and it's about having a good time. But he's not unlikable, right? Everybody likes him. But he's also just full of himself. And I think that's an interesting aspect of narcissism, is it doesn't have to be this repulsive space, because sometimes I think, especially today with people who are really full of themselves, there's a strong disdain for that. Yeah. But sometimes people can be narcissistic but also be really likable.
Yeah. I think that he straddles a boundary, and I think that there is this overconfidence, this projective identity. Mm-hmm. Right? This is who I am, this is how grand I am. And then where it's on the other side is he's actually kind of a people pleaser sometimes. And I think that he oscillates between that line throughout the movie, as we kind of dig deeper into him. And we see this, right? So in the introduction, when we get out of the traumatic experience and we get into this kind of the precursor information, we see that he doesn't show up at times, right? So he misses the award ceremony, and Rhodey comes out and it's like, come on.
Dude.
Yeah. And immediately he goes into repair. So I think that he wants to maintain these relationships, and he knows exactly how to maintain them, but he always gives them like one unit shy.
Yeah.
And there's something terrifying about going all the way in.
Which, if we fast forward to the movie when he's dancing with Pepper, right? Like, there's some type of he's had these major traumatic experiences. He's trying to have different types of relationships. He does the same thing with Rhodey in the movie too.
Yep.
And he's trying to be more connected to her, but he also holds back a little bit. Yeah. And then that's where she ribs him a little bit later because he disappeared on her, right? Yeah. So there is this piece that he's wanting deeper connections, but he holds himself back. Yeah,
when talking about that likable piece, in the beginning, we see that everybody accommodates him. Because I think everybody has something they want from him, and I think he's very aware of that. And he uses that as leverage in the relationships in the beginning of the film. He knows that people want these aspects of him, and he's able to use that, in a more kind of, in a way that we might have some disgust with. We see him do it with the reporter.
Yeah.
She comes in and she thinks that she's going to illuminate these things that he doesn't know about himself. And immediately he owns it.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, this is me.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this was where the line was, but he adopts the phrase, the identity, I'm the merchant of death. And he goes, I'm not, so I think maybe the difference between, like that narcissist that we have discussed in, he goes, oh, I know. And he is actually pretty solid in his foundation, because up until this point, this information hasn't needed to be refuted. He hasn't had any consequences for who he is and what he does. So he owns those roles, and nobody can have authority over him if he does so.
He doesn't even, he owns these roles, but he doesn't see the depth of the roles, right? Like, I'm the merchant of death, but he doesn't recognize like what that actually means, right? What the depth of identifying with all these things are. Yeah, I'm probably going to sneeze. Oh, of course, as I say it, I lose it. That's going to come back at the worst time. He doesn't see the consequences yet, because everybody's accommodating, because he's giving enough to keep them tethered. They continue to work with him. So since there hasn't been this like, oh my gosh, I lost something I want, he can continue with those roles and he can own that. Absolutely. Well, what were some of the questions that came up for you kind of with this? With this movie? Or with this movie. Just with the scene, with maybe the beginning as he's getting like captured, or just the part of the movie before it takes off where he becomes like Iron Man. Okay. I think seeing the contrast of like him getting captured and then seeing this this kind of peaceful space, I think that what comes up a lot is the naivety. So we're shown kind of the consequences of the behavior before we even see who he is. Yeah. And so as we watched, I think I definitely felt, I was like, oh, how naive you are. You're owning this identity, and it's coming back to bite you in the butt here in a minute. Yeah. Well, how often when we are naive does that happen? If you ask me as a therapist, all the time. I think that anything that we are not looking at and we don't have a conscious awareness to, it can have a way of getting in front of us. So think of, for example, if we're walking down steps, I don't know about you, I'm a little bit of an anxious person, so I'm always looking at the steps as I walk down. And so as I have this awareness, I'm not going to get tripped up on anything. And I think that's something that we start to see, is we can see how his behavior leaves him very vulnerable. And so, as we kind of move into this next part where we catch up finally with the movie, we see the attack happen. And we see it beyond just the moment of the Humvee getting attacked. And I think it was really poignant that in the first 20 minutes, we're shown how maybe dismissive or how detached he is, right? Something that I immediately picked up on was that's like behavior that we might say someone is heartless. Yeah. Right? And so what is the first thing that we notice when he gets attacked and subsequently is getting doctored? In the cave, we see that his heart is compromised. So I thought it was really interesting that we see this heartless behavior and his heart is physically compromised now. Yeah, Marvel movies and symbols. No, yeah, he absolutely does, right? The arc reactor that he ends up putting in himself is a way to keep him alive. And it's almost as if the trauma is forcing him to pay attention to his heart. And his character, his actions from that point forward dramatically shift. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I think when I first watched it, I just kind of accepted, oh, it's his heart.
But in reality, what it is that, this arc reactor, I think, is magnetizing and is keeping the shards, the shrapnel, from entering his heart. So kind of what we're seeing is that he is beginning to see consequences, and how there are those consequences have to be attended to and constantly attended to.
Yeah.
That from this point on, if he allows himself to be naive and not take care of these things, it's over.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it goes to so much of the rest of the movie then we think about the symbols that go on his whole journey, right? That Tony Stark has a heart, right? The thing that Pepper gives him that ends up saving him in this movie, right? The original arc reactor he has to reinstall and hold on to. But it is a symbol of, I think, his ability to be so cold and heartless that he becomes the heart, right? And really, if we think about Avengers and all this other stuff that happens, he becomes the heart and the soul of the whole cinematic universe.
Yeah, and breaking the fourth wall for a second, being the first Marvel movie in the cinematic universe. So not only is he a staple in the Avengers movies that are building into it, but he really set the tone.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, as we talk about heart and him getting one, I couldn't help but notice the symbol of Yinsen, and immediately I was like, dang it, he's Jiminy Cricket, because everything that he said was challenging Tony Stark's way of life.
Yeah.
And so a couple kind of big poignant things that he's...
We have the same one. I have one of his things he said.
Okay, so let's see. Mine was, you're a man who has everything but nothing.
That's the thing I have written down.
Same one.
Yeah.
So that conversation was really interesting, because I think we see Tony Stark understand what that means, because I think he notices that he's been skating around the outside of what he wants and is now being challenged to kind of engage with it. But something that I want to kind of point out as a more depthy thing is that the Doctor doesn't have a name for quite some time. And Tony doesn't allow him to have a name, right? He doesn't attribute any worth to him until he uses his steady hands to pour the metal onto the sand. And I think that's because he is intimidated by Yinsen. And that kind of speaks to how in our internal world, we don't name the parts of us if we don't see any value in them. And so as soon as he finds that there's value in Yinsen, he asks more about him. And now all of a sudden he's a character that comes to life. Yeah. And a character that he allows to break bread with him.
Yeah. Well, and if we're looking at maybe the archetype of that character, right? Yeah. He's the Obi-Wan. He's the wizard, right? He's the person who's going to come in and challenge your thoughts, teach you a little something, and then very quickly disappear. Yeah. And that's exactly what happens, right? This thing is like, you're a man who has everything and nothing. Yeah. Is pretty much the it's not just being stuck, but that's the catalyst to get him to find something, to have something, something of meaning, not just anything he wants, because he can have anything he wants, but there's no meaning behind it. And that really is a statement for me represented like, you need to go find meaning in your life, in your relationships. You need to have some type of depth, a deeper connection. Yeah,
I think he's being challenged to get out of social status and social symbols. He sees this individual in a cave having all this richness in his life and coming from nothing. And so he does attach to that, and he looks at how he does have things, but not things that he can call his own.
Yeah. When I think it's magnified when he dies in the cave.
Yes.
And he's like, oh, my family's already dead, which was, the whole thing was built on a lie.
Yeah.
And in that moment, you can see that he was only there to like help Tony. And that's the only thing he had joy or anything that brought him purpose in that moment was that. And you can kind of see like Robert Downey Jr.'s face that like is processing all of that in the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that then is one of the other catalysts that have him stick with building the Iron Man suit when he gets back, right?
Yeah.
It's not just surviving in the moment, but saying, okay, I need to find meaning, and somebody like this lost everything, and people shouldn't have to lose everything.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, and we're going to do a callback to episode 1 here. Like Bing Bong, right? That some parts of us aren't meant to be there forever. And so Yinsen comes in and revitalizes a part of humanity in Tony. And once he is able to absorb that information himself, when he can integrate that into himself, he no longer needs the symbol, because now it becomes part of his like his moral foundation.
Yeah.
And there's something, and I don't know if I wrote, I did, in that dying moment, it's don't waste your life. And I think that was really kind of what sparked him to kind of get up and do more of these things, to live life with meaning. That's really kind of what I got from that. And how poignant is that the next thing he moves into is he gets out of the cave and he destroys all of the weapons. His legacy, right? I think that this is kind of where we begin to see him change his way of thought and to want to become someone different. Something that you're going to hear me say a lot from this point on is this is Tony finally taking accountability for his image, both how he sees himself and how he allows others to see him.
Hey guys, hopefully you're enjoying the show so far. If you're listening to this, make sure that you subscribe and you review on your favorite podcast station. If you're listening to this on YouTube, go and hit subscribe and the like button because it really helps the podcast grow. If you leave a comment down below, we will be giving away prizes. And then if you go to the disneytherapist.com/review, there's a whole breakdown of ways that you can earn free prizes and shout outs in the podcast in future episodes. So if you enjoy the podcast and would like to support us, go on and follow that. And with that, we'll get back to the show.
I'll actually ask you something.
Go ahead and ask me something.
I'm going to. And so immediately after the events in the desert, we see him come back.
Yeah.
Actually, no. It actually happens while he's in the desert. Rhodey comes out, and the first thing they do is joke, right? How was the fun, V?
Yeah.
Next time you ride with me. And when he comes back and he lands, it's the same tone. I think that's something that I picked up on right away was he can't express the trauma, and he can't share his emotions to who we are told are his best friends.
Yeah.
So
is that a question? Or
no. So I'm curious, especially because I know that you work with couples more than I do. What does that say about his dynamics and these relationships that he is willing to hint at something happened, but not go into it with them?
Which is what we all do in relationships, really, right? Like, how often do we actually turn to our friends or our partners and we say, this is what I'm really thinking. This is what I'm really feeling. I really need you to show up for me. That what we do is I always say it's we talk around it. We tell a story of what we need emotionally.
Yeah.
But we get caught up in the story, and then people get confused with the story because they don't recognize what you need.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he does, right? He doesn't know what it's like to let people in. And I think it's poignant when he calls the press conference, right? So right after he gets back, he lands, he calls the press conference, and he has everybody sit down, and the first thing that he says is, I never got to say goodbye to my father.
Yeah.
Right? So there's this deep space that we continue to grow through his character journey after this movie, which is major abandonment issues, right? Like an abandonment in the sense of he lost something that he was never able to process. And because he was never able to process that loss, in a way, he's always used his intellect, his income, and all these things to keep people at a distance. And he's nice to all his friends, like he values all of them, but he doesn't know how to let them in all the way. Like there's always this push and pull between keeping someone at a distance and letting them all the way in.
And as you know, Tony Stark, why do you think he wants to keep people kind of that one step away?
If he was a client and he was sitting on my thing, I might hypothesize that he keeps people away because he'll lose them.
I was thinking the same thing. When you brought up the not being able to say bye to his dad, I immediately went to, man, he's wounded. He's scared to let someone in because what if they don't stay? And so now we can kind of understand why he does that dance where he steps out, pulls them in, and then as soon as he has them in, he takes a step back. So I think what happens when he lands, I think he's having a very emotional moment with Pepper, and as soon as she kind of chases, he steps back.
Yep.
He knows that he's got the hook. So then we roll into this press conference. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that the press conference was his way of saying, I need to be more accountable. And immediately we see pushback because we get introduced to our villain, right? And Obadiah says, like, wow, I wish you would have given me a heads up. He's kind of that part of somebody who resists the new boundary, the new integration.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think thematically happens is we are looking at how we set boundaries and how we build relationships. And so Obadiah is someone who is unable to accept us for who we want to be. And that's always happens when we go through any kind of change, big or small. Whether it's, hey, I can't play as much video games because I'm in grad school, right?
I feel like that's a real life experience right there.
Yeah, right. But it's the, hey, I need to do something different. Can you guys make space for me? And we see Obadiah as someone who is trying to do that initially.
To his own ends, right? Which
Yes.
we find out later. But it's also like he represents the status quo, right?
Yeah.
This is what we do. This is how we've always done it.
Yeah.
Like, you should be comfortable doing it this way.
Yeah.
And this is the only way we do it, right? Very surfacey. And I think that's one of the things that keeps us stuck from forming deeper relationships a lot of time is the status quo.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay, so I'm a guy, we don't talk about those things. Or we're not supposed to do these things in a relationship. We're constantly putting up these barriers to like what is normal, what is the status quo. And that's one of the things I think that keeps him stuck is this is how he's always been, right? Like in a way, this guy was his surrogate father.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that you say this is how it always is, with the company. He cannot allow Tony to introduce any change because he's very rigid. And we do experience that as we navigate life, as we learn more about ourselves, as we, try to change careers or just try to change things for ourselves. And not everybody is ready for us to make that change. Not that not all of them are malicious. Of course, we find that Obadiah is.
Yeah.
But some people want to be exactly who they were. And it's hard to make space for letting someone else change because that sparks something in us.
Yeah, if we're around other people who are changing, we have to then deal with those parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't want to look at those things, which is why sometimes when your friends start to go through something or your partner goes through something, there's a lot more conflict because you might not be willing to change.
Yeah.
It makes me think of a piece that's a little bit off, but I think it hits both of these, the abandonment piece and then this piece, which is there's a quick line where Tony says to Rhodey, like, hey, I'm working on something over here. Come over, right? And Rhodey goes, oh, cool, you're back to work. Like, he's like, no, it's something different. He's like, I don't have time for this, right? He just brushes off because that's what Rhodey always does. But for Tony, like, that's a huge step.
Yeah.
So far in his character development, as from what we've seen, is he's putting his hand out at Fringe saying, hey, come over here. I trust you enough to see something.
Yeah.
And Rhodey missed all those signs and kind of was the status quo, right? Just like Obadiah was the status quo. Rhodey was still doing the status quo up until the first scene where he's in actual suit and kind of goes and blows stuff up.
Yeah. Man, just sitting with that scene, I'm reminded again, because when I had that, I was hurt. I felt so wounded by that comment because up until this point, I loved Rhodey. I was like, man, he seems like really healthy. He seems really fun. And man, he just missed this major moment.
But doesn't it speak volumes though? Like, so if you're having that emotional reaction to these characters interacting, doesn't it kind of shows us how even in the best scenarios, even though he's such a good friend, he always shows up, he is really healthy. We miss moments all the time.
Yeah.
And they can hurt.
Yeah. And it's not one person's job to always do it. And so I want to make sure that as much as that was a very wounding moment, it wasn't solely his responsibility to keep this relationship afloat. And unfortunately, this is where we move into where Tony's wounds are about abandonment and not feeling safe. Because I think if Tony had a better foundation and felt more secure, he could have said, this is really important to me and I need you. And I think if he would have conveyed that, we would have saw a different interaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's something that's interesting is when he does that press conference, something that he's doing is he's paying attention to the parts of himself that create friction, and he wants to put an immediate stop to those parts. And what we're talking about is how the status quo really challenges us and says, do you really want to do that? And we come up to this point where we have to ask ourselves, what's more important, this authenticity that we're starting to build, or maintaining relationships from the past?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think the we can ask those questions, but we have to maybe use Tony as a cautionary tale, which is we can't just throw a press conference and make big changes.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's going to be a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
Right? Which actually sets the ball rolling for major, for the confrontation at the end of the movie, right?
Yeah.
Is that he's like, no, we're going to do this and we're going to do this and we're going to do this. That we have to navigate like where we fall, but we can't just do it in one press conference. We can't just do it in one step and say, oh, nope, I'm changed. It's completely new. Because it doesn't work. It won't stick.
Yeah.
So we have to be really cautious about that.
What you're stepping into is oversharing, and how it might sound confident for us to get out there and scream and shout what we're going to do, but what we're really doing is we are opening ourselves to attack. Now, this is attack from our peers, this is attack from our role models, and this is attack from our own shadow.
Yeah.
Right? We have basically painted a big target on our head, and isn't it so funny that that's what they used, right? Tony didn't just paint a target on his head, he painted a target on Obadiah's head too.
Yep.
So he is forcing his change and his new ideology onto everyone around him without vetting, right? That'd be like, if I had this beautiful idea and I try to share it with some random stranger at Starbucks, that could not be met well. And I could lose my motivation because I shared with someone who I didn't vet. And that's definitely what we see as we kind of progress through the movie. We see Obadiah increasingly push back.
Yes. Brene Brown talks about, I quoted her in the first episode. And I quote her a lot.
Same.
So she has like an audio program called The Power of Vulnerability.
Yep.
And in that, she talks about one of the armors that we do to avoid vulnerability is oversharing, right? And I think that that's actually a super common armor that we all do is if we overshare and it pushes people away, we really don't have to feel the hurt of if I share it in a really vulnerable way. Mm-hmm. And then you reject me.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you were just saying is like he's oversharing all this stuff that he's thinking and feeling in the moment. In the same way he would never let anyone in, he's now oversharing and not letting anyone in.
Yeah.
Right. But at least in the sense of letting people know he's working on like the Iron Man suits, he's trying to let Rhodey in. He's trying to let Pepper in a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the last line of the movie, right, saying, I am Iron Man, letting the whole world know. Again, is this overshare, which is possibly keeping people at a distance, which is something that he'll do his entire character arc.
So one of the other aspects of oversharing is we can think we've done it. If we can say it to everybody, then we've clearly done the work. And I think that we see that as we progress through Tony's story is kind of in the next kind of major moment that I've written down is when he's working in his lab and Obadiah comes with pizza, right? And this is where Obadiah says that the board is not happy with him. And he has this Freudian slip because he says that they think that Tony is not being responsible. And to pull up the quote, he goes, I am being responsible. That's a new direction for me. And quickly he goes, for the company, right? Recognizing that his press conference and his overshare is he was trying to take control of a situation that's not all his.
Yeah.
He wants to take accountability for himself, but he uses the company to take accountability for him. And we can see how murky that is because now the company doesn't want to do it.
Yeah. That he has not really taken a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
And that there's this piece of working through like his trauma and taking responsibility in becoming the superhero, which is a very common myth in superhero thing, right? It's usually some type of an abandonment, right, through death. Usually it's a tragic death, some trauma from that. And then we use a corrupt system, right? The mixture of a traumatic death and a corrupt system is part of the superhero mythos, right? Those things exist, superhero forms, right? That's the Spider-Man journey, that's the Batman journey, that's Iron Man. And that's kind of what I think pushes him to then immediately go into, because it's right after the pizza thing, he goes to the thing and he sees the photos of the Stark weapons being sold.
Yep.
Oh, superhero time, right? Like he armors up.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the trauma, but the corruption of the status quo.
Yeah. More specifically, I think the corruption of his company, which he left in charge of his accountability.
Yeah.
And so from that, when he feels inspired to do something, right, because he's confronted with these pictures and he goes, wow, they're not doing what I said. He starts to build a inner locus of control, and he goes, I'm going to take care of this. So what does he do? He confronts Obadiah. And I think what happens right there is he's actually confronted with his own naivety. And I think that something that happens is he sees that he was naive to think that everybody was just going to agree with him, because this is when Obadiah
because that's what everybody's always done up to this point.
Yeah. This is where Obadiah does the villain thing, where he monologues.
Yeah.
Right? He says that this is, who do you think moved to dismiss you? Yada, 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 yada. And this is where he begins to highlight himself as the villain.
Absolutely. Blank, blank, blank.
So kind of stemming from there, some of the things that I had kind of written down was in the challenge to take more control, when he realizes that Obadiah isn't going to help him and the company isn't in his best interest. This is when we see him, like as you said, the hero mythos. He puts on the suit and he goes to the deserty area, and he forcibly removes those people in power. He is trying to overwrite his quote-unquote legacy that we saw in the beginning with his weapons. Noticing that, blowing up the weapons and holding the press conference wasn't actually taking charge. It was kind of talking big game. And so we see him move into that territory.
How often do we do that? Where we talk, we do the work, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, but our actions don't always align with what we're saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes we stay really stuck because we're just caught up in that talking about it, not necessarily the positive action movement.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we've kind of joked about before, I'm going to throw that word out there now. This is where the ego death came in.
Okay. So you're going to have to break that down.
I am. So
if you're like me, that don't know what that means.
So from the beginning of the film, we see Tony in one light, that this is the way he lives, this is how he sees things. And when he gets attacked and he goes through this transformative experience with the Yinsen, we see that alter ego, right, the Tony Stark we saw at the beginning, that part has to die. Right? He has to allow that to turn into something else. And it's really interesting because Obadiah actually says that when he is confronting Pepper in the office later in the movie. He says, I too was really excited to see Tony back, but I think that he died in that cave. And I think that was really symbolic, because he did. Because he was faced with the reality of his world. And if he stayed in that personality, I think that he would have came back splintered. And he couldn't allow himself to exist in a world that looked like that. So he had to allow these collection of beliefs to die. But unfortunately, when he had the press conference, he inflated his ego and thought, I've done it. I've acknowledged it. No one else can hold me accountable. Till they did.
Yeah.
And so I think when he confronts Obadiah, that's the last part of the naivety that gets challenged. When he realizes that he hasn't taken full accountability, he fully lets the company version of him, the rich, the rich playboy, when he lets that part of him kind of die, he can now don the Iron Man suit, because that's when he can take full accountability and say, no longer am I going to let everybody else fight my battles. I'm going to step in.
So that's what ego death is in this movie.
Yeah.
So when you say, how does ego death show up for us?
So when we have to challenge what we think we are, and I think that sometimes we're not ready for that, so we talk big, because we talk about who we want to be, but we're scared to let that part of us go, because we've been hanging on to that for so long. And so it really does take us to dive into our imagination and to wonder, if this part of us starts to subside, what can be reborn?
Yeah, this is where we get stuck in thinking, this is who I'm going to be, this is who I'm going to be, this is who I'm going to be. And the ego death is saying, maybe that's not who I am. Maybe that's not who. I have to grieve. I have to let that go. Which I think, in a way, at least for me in my work with couples, is when people break up, why there's such a struggle. Yeah. Because it's not just grieving the loss of the breakup. It's grieving the loss of the future of the relationship, that I have to like let go of everything that existed and I thought was going to happen and see what comes next. Be curious enough to see what could take its place, because it's not what I thought it was going to be.
Absolutely. And to really drive that point home, it's the identity piece, that the loss of the future and the future me. And so I think that what you're tapping into is that for us to move on into the next thing, we can't carry the old version in. So we have to grieve, allow that part of us to pass. Right? So think about it, right? Because if Tony still was ignorant and was the merchant of death, could he be Iron Man? And so that's where, kind of that terminology of, I think we have to go through the steps in chronological order. We can't put on the new suit and then let the old one pass, because there's not enough room for both of us in this suit.
We have to be willing to risk to let go of the part of us that we're so caught up in. Die, the ego part, right?
Yeah.
Who we are, die to be able to become who we can be.
Yes.
That's really hard to do, isn't it?
It is. I think that's why we love the mythos of the phoenix so much, right? Because in death comes life.
Well, why superhero movies are so strong right now, right? And they all have this origin story, which is letting go of who I was, becoming who I am. And we see that, I think, as a theme in most, if not almost all the superhero movies, right? Letting go of something to become something else.
And they always are powerful at the end of their journey.
Yes.
And I think we love that. And I think for us, it's hard to do that, and because maybe we don't feel as powerful as a superhero, but we need to find our personal kind of authority, our personal power.
Well, that we do have that power, right? With the concept of a myth or of a story, right?
Yeah.
Like MCU is so big right now because the superheroes are able to do things that we're not able to do in our regular life. But if we bubble down that myth and look at the archetypes within us, we all have that power to actually be a superhero in our own world, in our own way. But we have to let go of the things stopping us to become part of, to go into that journey.
And I'm smiling a lot because leaning into something I think we said in our last podcast, sometimes we have to find our good enough.
Yep. Okay, so quick break from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you're finding this entertaining and some value, and you're learning some stuff from us. Hopefully, if not, we're just having fun ourselves, so this is cool. If you'd like to support the show and help the show continue to grow, we do polls. You can see our show notes. You get to pick future content. You can all do that through our Patreon page. You can find it through the disneytherapist.com, and then you can see it in our menu about support. It takes you to our Patreon page where you can support the show and help us kind of develop where the show is going to go. So that's all we have in this little break, and we're going to get back to the last little bit.
So kind of leaving the space of ego death and how deep that can be, I want to turn the page and go talk about the relationships. So we've talked about how at the beginning, Tony is always like a step away, always trying to
keep people at a distance.
Yeah, keep him at a distance, but keep him hooked enough.
Yeah.
And so on his return trip from this, this big fight, we see two things happen. We see him confront the relationship with Rhodey, when he's living underneath the plane, right?
Yeah.
Because of that wound earlier, because Rhodey didn't want to partake in his new toy.
Yeah.
He doesn't begin by saying, "Hey, it's me." And not until he has this very stressful interaction where he's like getting shot at by planes.
Until he absolutely has to.
Yeah, does he open up about it. And I think that when he finally is open about it's him, right? It's very exasperating. It's me, right? Well, of course, because he's on adrenaline, he's underneath this plane. He says it's me, and he opens up. And I think Rhodey actually kind of laughs. And there's this kind of like lightness that happens when he acknowledges it, and then he gets to go into the joking banter of you owe me a plane. And so I think that there's a repair in that relationship there when they're both willing to say, hey, this is where we're at, let's move forward, let's talk about it. I think Rhodey actually makes space. He says like, not here, but we're going to find a way. And we see that because what happens is he goes to the press conference. It was just a training exercise.
Yeah.
He's not going to throw Tony under the bus because there's been a repair.
Yes.
And then we also see it with Pepper. But I think Pepper's is a little bit more kind of impactful for me because she shows up, she sees him in the suit, and she goes, I quit. right? She's saying that I can't play with you anymore. I can't play in this space. And it challenges Tony to have to do something that he hasn't done the entire film. Be honest.
Yes.
You know, and maybe not even honest. I think that he actually is being as honest as he can, as he feels like he can be. This is him being authentic.
Yeah, and transparent.
Yes. And in doing so, Pepper picks up the keys and can continue working with him because now she understands him, and he conveys understanding her.
I think one in that scene specifically, at least the way I remember it, is he's authentic.
Yeah.
He's transparent. And he doesn't use humor, right?
Yeah.
That one of the things that he does to try to like repair is use humor a lot.
Yeah.
And why that's a great repair mechanism, some of the times it also can intensify disconnection. We use humor incorrectly. Yeah. And I think he picked up on the subtle ways that she was like done.
Yeah.
That he chose not to use humor and he actually went to that more vulnerable space. Mm-hmm. And it works. And I think that's a great lesson that we have to learn, which is humor is great to repair when there's maybe not a big disconnect, but once there's a bigger disconnect, humor is not going to work for us. We have to find a way to be more authentic and more transparent, more honest.
As I sit with that, I think that humor is good to indicate I no longer carry these ill feelings that we were discussing or that we were having in conflict, and that wouldn't have worked in this situation. This was a situation where we needed to say, I hear you. That this isn't a joke, right? Because I think that her worry was that in his joking manner that he was going to get himself killed. I think that's actually something that she indicates mm-hmm. is I can't be here and watch you die.
Yeah.
And what he steps into is, no, this is really serious and I'm taking it serious. So he is hearing her concern and he's connecting with her.
He validated her.
Yeah. And so I think that was really interesting and really poignant towards the conclusion of this movie is now everything's serious. You know, we unearth that Obadiah is now a villain. He's went to the cave and he is shown that he was a conspirator, that he was actually trying to kill Tony. And we see him forcibly come in and remove Tony's heart, what's keeping his heart safe.
Yeah.
And so I think that the rest of the tone of the movie is a very serious tone. And we move into... side note, right? Rhodey comes in and helps him get up after feeling exasperated on the floor. Once again, showing that there's been repairs with primary relationships. But he puts on the suit and he goes out to fight. And something that I noted about Tony is by the end of this movie, because he is tired of everybody fighting his battles, he is constantly putting his life in danger to be accountable. So here he is running on the old arc reactor, which has no power to run the suit. And we see him, I think at he's bringing himself into the cold air and, freezing and falling. And then we also see him tell Pepper to start the reactor.
Yeah, blow it. And then initially when it was don't blow me in it, it's now just do it. He's willing to die to take down something that he felt like he caused, right? The other Iron Man suit. I forget what they call it. But he takes everything serious now. And we see that actually, I think, in every iteration of Iron Man from here. Is that he's always willing to go the extra mile to make sure that he has done all he can. And that it's done after, it's a last case scenario. He doesn't choose to do that, right?
Yeah.
He's always wanting to make sure everybody else is safe.
Yeah.
And he'll sacrifice himself if he absolutely has to.
Yes.
But he doesn't necessarily want to.
He's not a martyr.
No.
And that is not something I think we would ever categorize Tony Stark as. But I think that because of this new direction, because of this accountability and the pride that he has with being held accountable, I think he's always willing to take that step if absolutely necessary. And I think
only and necessary is to only protect the people who are close to him, which isn't very many people.
Yeah. In this movie.
Yeah.
We start to see that evolve. And I had to because it was eating at me.
I know.
But isn't it beautiful that the conclusion of the movie is the most accountable thing you can do? I am Iron Man.
Sounds like a good place to stop. Do you have any other thoughts?
A little bit. So we've kind of hinted at this, and one of the things that I thought was really important to pull out was Jarvis is Tony's best relationship.
Okay.
And so I want to kind of a little bit. So he's able to be the most descriptive with Jarvis. And something that I kind of jotted down was, is it because Jarvis completely validates Tony instead of immediately criticizing? Because in every other relationship, Tony says something amazing, crazy, ridiculous, and the first thing he's met with everybody else is the, oh, come on, really? And Jarvis goes, yeah, but how about this? And so I think that there's a lot of validation because we see him.
That's an absolute Tony thing.
So I thought that was really interesting to point out.
What do you think the villain is, or the moral of the villainy is of this movie?
So interesting, because that was actually going to be the next thing I rolled into is malicious naivety.
Okay, explain.
So when we are naive, there breeds this potential to get attacked on it. And so Obadiah plays into that naive nature that Tony has. And so when we do things like we overshare or we don't take full accountability and we just kind of set it on its course and we take our hands off, we leave ourselves open to getting criticized and attacked. And so I think that what happened is that Tony knew he needed to take accountability, but he wasn't absolutely ready. And that's the oversharing piece. And then we're being faced with what it actually means to take accountability, and how anytime that we set our course that way, if we kind of let go of the steering wheel, we can end up in some pretty vicious crashes.
Absolutely. I saw the villain of the movie as greed.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Because Obadiah is all about just making more money, making the world safer. This is what I'm going to do. It was all about greed and putting myself first, putting my economics first, putting everything else first. Right? And Tony's arc or themes throughout the movie is sacrifice and selflessness. Yeah. Right? Which is counter to greed and self-centeredness. Right? So it's these spectrums that I think the movie was drawing a lot of parallels to. Okay. Which we have to be thoughtful of in ourselves, right? Like that we can see even in Tony and within ourselves, there's a healthy level of self-confidence. Yeah. But then there's also that pace where we might go into this greedy self-centeredness. Yeah. And that's what we all have to work on.
I think that what you're talking about in your image is the poles. Yep. The opposite poles of a healthier, balanced collective space, which might be being able to attend to financial need and maybe some splurging, while also needing to kind of enliven some of that accountability and some of that, it's almost like the humanity. Mm-hmm. And we got to see what happens when poles clash.
Yeah, there's a big explosion at the end of the movie.
Yes. So, kind of one of the last thoughts I had, and we kind of hinted at the beginning, not framing it as a question, but even in our process, it is really hard to not talk about where Tony's character ends.
Yeah, so Endgame came out a year ago, this weekend or two.
Only a year.
It is really hard to just look at a small piece and start to dive into how influential and all the different things that happen in this one piece. Yeah. I'm sure we will end up doing an episode where we'll dive into Tony Stark specifically and all the different spaces he shows up, and I think that would be fun with all of the maybe core Avenger type characters to see how they've grown and changed throughout the time.
Absolutely, but before we can get there, we do have to get through all those movies. So
well, we have some more episode ideals coming up then, I guess.
Absolutely, and as hopefully as people kind of enjoy this and comment on it, we can kind of ramp it up and try to find ways to kind of incorporate these things. I don't want to say with speed or haste, because that's unrealistic. But being able to, as you said, right, we're going to have a poll set up. And how we can kind of set up kind of what people are interested in. If we need to lean more into Marvel for a little bit, it'll be interesting to see kind of how people want us to tether some of this.
Was it surprising for you to get so much out of the Marvel movie? Because I found when I was kind of like rewatching Iron Man is there were bits and pieces. Like I have like a page of like different notes, and you have like 3 pages. So like, I guess I'm just curious about what was it about you think the movie that spoke to you at such a like fundamental level.
I think, and the reason why I use such a jarring word, that ego death, I think because something that I saw in Iron Man is something I see in a lot of clients, in that we can hold on to a part of us and not let ourselves grow. And so I think it was really beautiful to see a character maybe renounce some of the core identity aspects and being able to use kind of this platform to talk about how they can move into something else.
Do you think, so this might be a little too personal.
No, it's okay.
Do you think that journey represents a lot of just your own personal journey too? Of letting things go? Absolutely.
And so I'm going to answer that kind of in 2 parts. I think one, and I can't speak for everybody, but I know that in my cohort in grad school, the path to becoming a therapist I felt was really challenging because there is a lot of death of my naivety, my innocence. I'm being challenged to look at all the gritty parts of me because I got to make sure that I am aware of those things so I'm not imparting and dropping that on clients. So there's that piece of just the journey of becoming a therapist. And then 2, I am very open about how much of a child I have inside of me.
Yeah.
And that comes into question a lot, whether it's wanting to watch Disney movies all day, wanting to stream Netflix, play video games. I can't do that like how I used to. And so I have had to allow some parts of that to wither. I don't think that this is something that I have to let die, but I do have to allow the way I've interacted with it fall to the side to kind of create this new part. Because without it, I was running anxious. So like I was trying to still be the kid over here and the adult over here, and
you
they weren't
segmented all the different parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Well, so the reason I kind of asked that question is because I think it speaks volumes to why I kind of love this format of like looking at like movies and TV shows and all this stuff, because I always find a lot of value in why am I drawn to this and what's going on.
Yeah.
And the fact that I had like a page of notes and you had like 3 pages of notes, I think speaks to there's something in these themes of this story that's resonating with the themes going on inside of your psyche and your soul.
Yeah.
Versus I didn't have the same stuff, so I didn't get as activated, right?
Yeah.
Which is why when we want to explore ourselves, what are we drawn to? Like, what media are we drawn to? What movies resonate with us? What characters resonate with us? Because when we can start to pay attention to what's resonating, then we can learn more about ourselves, right? So there was something about rewatching this that really resonated with you. Yeah. Well, I watched it and I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed
but
it.
I didn't like. I know you should, but like it didn't necessarily resonate with me in the same way.
Yeah.
And it's not that you can't get stuff out of it, but you can learn a lot more, I think, about yourself.
Yeah.
When something resonates.
Yeah. Why I think the depth approach in therapy and narrative approaches are so good, because it allows us to speak a language of what the client wants to bring in. So when we can understand what activates us and we can get into the depth of it, we understand what we're attending to.
Yeah. And when we say depth, for those of you who are listening who aren't therapists, depth and narrative are types of like theories that are the way we would conceptualize what an issue is.
Yeah.
So
that's a whole other segment.
I always have to jump in and be like, okay, here's a therapy word. Let me explain what the therapy word is. So. Yeah. Okay, well, with that, we will end this week's episode, and we will see you guys next time. Make sure you subscribe, like, comment, all that fun jazz. And with that, bye now. We need an ending.
We do.